He came back at dawn. The smoke was still rising when Milo and Astos crossed the last low hill south of the railroad tracks and saw what was left of Ludlow. The canvas was gone. The poles stood in places, some still burning at the tips like oversized candles, but most had collapsed across each other in arrangements no longer resembling anything built by human hands. The morning sky ran pale blue at the horizon and deepened overhead to something that should have been beautiful. The whole world smelled of scorched cotton, and something else, something his mind refused to name, not because he lacked the word, but because using it would mean accepting what it meant. He walked between collapsed tents and fallen poles and ash. He saw shoes. He registered this, the shoes, and filed it in the place in his mind where he was storing things he would look at later, when looking was possible, when the more urgent thing was done. The more urgent thing was the pit. The tent he shared with Parthena and Stavros and little Katina had stood near the southern edge of the colony. He had paced the distance himself in September, 40 yards from the main road. A man who measured distances, who found comfort in knowable dimensions. He walked them now. The tent was gone. The 2 poles he had set lay flat, and the canvas was a black-rimmed swatch of nothing. He stopped thinking about the tent. He was looking at the board. He had laid a heavy plank over the pit entrance in October, salvaged from a collapsed mine structure 3 miles north. The board was still there. One edge was charred. It had not burned through. He knelt, got his fingers under the edge and pulled it aside. Dark. Smoke. A smell not quite of fire, but of the absence of air, of a space closed too long, of a space where breathing had happened, and then stopped. He called her name. He heard movement. Then her voice. Then, and here he pressed his forehead against the lip of the pit, just for a moment, just for one shaking breath. The voice of his son, Stavros, saying Papa in Greek, saying it twice. The way a 6-year-old says the word when fear has left, and what remains is the announcement. You are found. The waiting is over. They came up. Parthena first, pulling Katina behind her. Then Stavros. Then 2 more children who were not his, Demetria and Spiro Kalentos, whose father had spent the night in the arroyo beside Milo, and was now running toward them across the ruined camp, their names already in the air. Milo held his wife and children in the ash of their home and counted them. 4. He counted again. He counted the children who had come out of his pit. He registered the number and held it. Then Parthena said quietly, so the children wouldn't hear, "There is another pit." She told him where it was. She told him she had not been able to go to it yet. She told him she had heard nothing from it in the night. He went. The tent had belonged to the Petrucci family, Southern Italian, Francesco and Celia and their children, and it had stood in the middle of the colony's central row, about 20 yards from the well. Francesco Petrucci had dug his pit deeper than most because he had 3 children, including an infant, and he had dug it as deep as he could get it. The depth of the pit, when the tent above it burned, meant nothing. Milo found the board. He moved it. He looked down. He called for Louis Tikas and then remembered, with a grief that arrived like a physical blow, that Louis Tikas was dead, shot in the back while a prisoner, the man you called in Ludlow when you needed someone who could look at a terrible thing and know what to do. He was gone. Milo called for Trinidad Espinosa instead. Trinidad came. He looked into the pit. He removed his hat. He stood that way for a long time. Then he said, in the Spanish Milo had only partly learned in 7 months working beside him, "I'm going to go find something to cover them." He did. They dug this pit to protect their children from bullets. The bullets did not kill them. The fire did. The fire was set by members of the Colorado National Guard, acting on orders, on Easter Monday, 1914, in the state of Colorado, in the United States of America. The mine was owned and operated by the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, the majority interest of which was held by John D. Rockefeller, Jr. of New York City. The children in the pit were between 4 months and 8 years old. Their names are known. This is a story about their names. Before the pit, there was a home. This requires patience, yours and the narrator's both. What happened on April 20th, 1914, at the Ludlow tent colony makes no moral sense unless you first understand what Ludlow was before it became what it became. And what it was, for 7 months, was a community. The kind that forms when people have no other option, when everything else has been taken from them, and what remains is each other, and what they build together in the space between survival and the grave. The Colorado Fuel and Iron Company operated coal mines across the southeastern corner of Colorado. Ludlow, Aguilar, Walsenburg, Starkville, and a dozen smaller operations strung along the Purgatoire and Apachapa river valleys. The coal-fed steel furnaces that fed railroads, that moved goods, that made money that accumulated in lower Manhattan in the account of a man who had never been inside a coal mine and had no particular intention of changing that. The man was John D. Rockefeller, Jr., and he owned roughly 40% of CF&I, which gave him effective control, which he exercised through proxy men in Denver and through a management philosophy that could be summarized, without much distortion, as, the workers are a resource, and resources do not have demands. The miners who dug the coal were paid by the ton, not by the hour, not by the day, but by the weight of what they extracted. Colorado state law mandated certain protections: 8-hour days, payment in legal currency rather than company scrip, checkweighman elected by miners themselves to verify coal weights, the right to choose your own doctor. CF&I ignored most of these laws with the confidence of an organization that understood the enforcement mechanism was the state government, and the state government was populated largely by men who regarded CF&I's profitability as coterminous with Colorado's own. Milo Anastos arrived in Colorado in 1909. He had come from Heraklion, on the island of Crete, the second son of a family with too many sons for too little land. He had a cousin in Walsenburg who worked for CF&I and who sent word that the work was steady and the winters less brutal than Pennsylvania. The cousin did not mention the company stores, or the company scrip, or the armed mine guards who walked the perimeters of company towns with the specific combination of boredom and authority that characterized private police everywhere. After a while, you stop noticing the bars on the cage. Milo was 28 when he arrived, built the way men get built who have spent their adolescence working, broad through the chest and shoulders, with large, careful hands that could hold a pickaxe for 8 hours, and then lay a very small thing down very gently afterward. He met Parthena in 1910, a woman from Thessaloniki who had been educated beyond what most girls of her time and circumstance received. She could read Greek and had learned Italian and French, and she had the teacher's instinct for translating between systems of understanding, for finding the bridge between what a person knows and what they need to know. They married in 1911. Stavros was born in 1908 and Katina in 1910, and the family lived in company housing near the Ludlow mine, and the years accumulated and taught Milo things: what a loaded scale looked like, how the gap between theory and law functioned in practice, the size of the space between what he extracted and what he kept. When the United Mine Workers of America arrived in Colorado in the summer of 1913, organizing quietly and then less quietly, Milo attended 2 meetings before deciding. He went to the first because Louis Tikas had personally asked him to come, and you did not easily say no to Louis Tikas. Louis Tikas, his real name was Ilias Anastasios Spantidakis, shortened for American practicality, had come from the same Greek tradition as Milo, but from a different formation of it. He had educated himself beyond his background, and used that education as a kind of service, translating between Greek miners and English-speaking organizers, between Southern Italian families and Mexican families, between men who spoke only Spanish and men who spoke only Polish, and men who spoke only Serbian, finding in every case the passage from here to understood. He was 30 years old in 1913, and he moved through the world with the specific gravity of a man who other men had decided to trust, and who had decided to take that trust seriously. The UMWA's demands were not complicated. The 8-hour day that Colorado law already promised, payment in legal currency, check weighman, the right to choose their own doctors and stores, a 10% wage increase, and union recognition. The recognition was the one that mattered most to CF&I, and therefore the one CF&I was least willing to grant. Not because recognition would have bankrupted them, but because recognition would have meant power. And power was the thing CF&I's management philosophy had been built to deny. On September 23, 1913, approximately 11,000 miners in the Colorado coal fields walked off the job. The strike was nearly total. The mines shut down within days. The company evicted the striking miners and their families from company housing immediately. Within a week, in Colorado, in late September, with winter coming. This was not made in haste or in anger. It was calculated, the application of maximum pressure at minimum cost to the company. The company owned the houses. They had the legal right. The mine guards supervised the evictions with the efficiency that comes from not caring about the people in front of you. The UMWA was ready. The union had rented land near the mine entrances and ordered canvas from Denver, and by the time the evictions began, the framework of tent colonies was going up. Ludlow sat at the junction of the Ludlow siding and the main line of the Colorado and Southern Railway, roughly 18 miles north of Trinidad, in a broad open stretch of grassland and sage. The land was public. The guard could not legally remove them. By October, the Ludlow colony housed approximately 1,200 people. 1,200 people, in tents, in southern Colorado. With the mountains already white above them, and the nights dropping below freezing, and the guard moving into position on the ridge to the north, a low ridge but high enough to look down into every tent in the camp, which the guard did, with searchlights, beginning on the second night. Milo set up the iron cots and the wooden crate that served as a table, drove 2 nails into the center pole to hang coats, and watched Parthena unpack the things she had brought from the company house. The icon of St. George, the blue enamel pot, the photograph of her parents taken in Thessaloniki in 1901, a small bag of dried herbs her mother had given her at the boat, which she had saved for a sufficient occasion, and whose sufficient occasion had arrived in a tent in southeastern Colorado. The colony was multi-ethnic in a way that was unusual and, in its specific circumstances, functional. Greek families, Italian families, Mexican families, Serbian families, Anglo miners from West Virginia, African-American miners from further south. They organized the camp with military discipline, many of the men immigrants who had served in European armies. They had a school tent, a baseball diamond, an elected committee. They were building something. The school tent was Parthena's doing, and the doing of Rosa Espinosa, a Mexican woman who had taught school in Durango and had opinions about children not learning. They set up 3 rows of wooden benches and a blackboard that had been carried out of the company school by a woman named Dora Valentino, who had left her job along with everyone else and brought the blackboard because she thought it would be useful and was correct. The school operated every morning from 8 until noon and afternoons from 1 until 3, teaching reading and arithmetic and American history and geography and the songs Parthena had committed to memory in 3 languages, Greek, Italian, and English, because she believed songs were the fastest passage to a shared vocabulary, and shared vocabulary was the fastest passage to a shared world. Approximately 40 children attended. Stavros Anastos, 6 years old, came home one afternoon in November carrying a drawing of a horse. Head down, lines suggesting speed, unmistakably a horse. and announced in Greek that his friend Giuseppe had taught him to draw it. Giuseppe was the 7-year-old son of Francesco and Celia Petrucci, the family in the tent at the center of the camp's main row. Milo folded the drawing very carefully and put it in the wooden crate where he kept the things that mattered. Trinidad Espinosa had arrived at Ludlow from a different trajectory. He was 41 in 1913, which made him old by the standards of a profession where the average working life ended at 45. He had come to Colorado in 1909 after following Pancho Villa's advance columns north from Chihuahua for 2 years, not as a committed revolutionary initially, but as a man who found that the revolution was where the food was, and later as a man who had come to believe in it, which was the order in which most people arrived at their convictions. He had been present at battles that never made the history books and had seen what a machine gun does to men in open ground. He carried this knowledge in his body, in the places where understanding lives in people who have earned it. He had sent his wife and daughters to her sister in Pueblo because Trinidad understood what it meant when armed men positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking a civilian population. Then he slept alone in his tent and applied his military experience to domestic necessity. He walked the colony's perimeter and identified the low points where water would run, the sight lines from the ridge the guard was already using, the positions where a man with a rifle could cover the most ground. He was the one who first suggested digging the pits. Some of the men resisted. The pits felt like an admission that things could get worse, like planning for catastrophe invited it. Milo was among them, not from superstition, but from the practical assessment that a pit in a Colorado winter meant sitting in mud. Trinidad's response was patient and exact. The pits were not for mud-sitting, they were for staying alive. And staying alive in military situations required the ability to position yourself below the level of incoming fire. This was not a theory. This was arithmetic. By November, most families had dug a pit beneath their tent. Milo dug his 4 feet deep, deeper than the water table, shallower than preference, adjusted for the reality of caliche hardpan and a borrowed pick. He lined the bottom with boards. He put a heavy plank over the entrance. He told Stavros this was where they would go if there was shooting. Stavros, who had the practical imagination of a child raised in difficult circumstances, accepted this completely and began treating the pit as a fort. Children do this. It is one of the ways they survive the things adults do to the world. Agnes Folk had come to Trinidad, Colorado, in 1899 with her husband and stayed after he died in 1905, running a boarding house on Commercial Street. She was 53 in 1913, silver-haired and large-framed, possessed of a social manner that combined warmth and efficiency in equal measure. She was Anglo and Protestant, and from a background sufficiently removed from mining that she could have regarded the strike as other people's business, which was how most of Trinidad's Anglo commercial class chose to regard it. Agnes chose otherwise. She went to the Ludlow colony in late October with a wagon containing 2 cases of canned goods, 3 wool blankets, and a jar of hard candy. She was taken to Parthena immediately. Someone had correctly identified Parthena as the person you brought outsiders to, and Parthena received her with the Greek hospitality that offered food before asking questions. And Agnes sat in the tent with 2 small children watching her from behind the nearest cot, and ate bread with olive oil, and thought about the gap between the story she had heard in town, dangerous agitators, armed foreign radicals, and the woman sitting across from her offering coffee. After that, Agnes came twice a week through November, then weekly through the winter. She brought blankets, medicine, food, books from the Trinidad Public Library, once a pair of children's boots in approximately Stavros's size that she delivered without ceremony, and received a drawing of a horse in return. She attended the school tent and watched Parthena move between languages and between children, the way Parthena found the confused face in a group and went to it. Agnes had not had children. a grief she had made a kind of peace with, and the undeployed tenderness of that peace found its way to the children of the Ludlow colony, who received it without knowing what it was. She drove out in January through a snow that came down hard enough that she drove by compass and memory, and arrived to find the colony draped in white, and the children outside in it, because children are always outside in snow, regardless of circumstances, because snow remains an occasion, whatever else the world is doing. The colony organized a St. Nicholas Day celebration in December that involved more singing and more fermented beverage than the UMWA organizers officially approved of, and that Tikas attended anyway, because St. Nicholas Day in a tent colony in the middle of a Colorado winter strike was precisely the kind of thing you attended, whatever your official position on fermented beverage. Parthena brought sweet bread that she had produced from the small stove, which constituted the major achievement of her winter, and which she received credit for in 3 languages and at a level of detail that moved from the complimentary to the historical. Agnes, who came the following week and heard about it, brought a bottle of very good olive oil and wrote in her journal, "The bread was apparently extraordinary, and the celebration was real, and the people at this camp have made something worth protecting." February was the hardest month. The food stores were low, and the UMWA relief funds were continuous but not unlimited, and feeding 1,200 people through a Colorado winter tested the limits of what was available. Agnes's deliveries took on a more urgent character. She drove out twice a week in the coldest weeks, the wagon loaded to capacity, accepting no thanks beyond what she immediately deflected, which was her way of honoring the dignity of the people she was helping, treating assistance not as charity given from above, but as service rendered between equals in a shared emergency. Milo's daughter Katina was sick in February with a chest complaint that the colony's doctor, a young physician from Trinidad named Bellini, who came every Thursday and charged nothing, called a mild bronchitis and treated with steam and rest, and the kind of provisional confidence that good doctors deploy when certainty is unavailable. Katina was sick for 10 days and recovered, which Milo experienced as a mercy so pointed it felt like a warning. You have been lucky, and luck is not infinite. He sat with Katina on the cot in the evenings of her sickness and told her stories about the sea in Crete, the color of it in late summer, when the light came in low and the water turned from blue to green, to a color that had no name in any language he could think of. Katina listened with the patient attention of a sick child, who is therefore stationary and capable of a concentration unavailable to healthy children. She asked, "Were there fish you could see from above? Did the boats have colors?" "Yes," he told her. "The boats had colors, red and blue and white, and a kind of bright orange he had seen nowhere else in the world. The fishermen painted them themselves. Every boat was different. Every boat was somebody's idea of what color the world should be." Tikas came to dinner at the Anastos tent once a week through those months. He sat on the wooden crate and ate whatever Parthena put in front of him with the sincere gratitude of a man who lives alone, and talked to Stavros about schools in Greece and about the horses Stavros was becoming obsessed with, having seen the guards' horses on the ridge and developed the standard 6-year-old's urgent, undiscriminating love of them. After the food was cleared away, he and Milo sat in the light of the kerosene lamp and talked about Crete and the sea and the quality of late summer light over the Aegean, which was the most comfortable distance from where they were. Parthena observed these evenings with careful attention and concluded that Louis Tikas was lonely, in a way inseparable from his function, that the role of holding everyone together had left him with no one to hold him, that the bridge he had built between all these people was one he stood on alone. She did not say this to him, because it would have embarrassed him, and because she was not sure he was ready to hear it. She was still thinking about it in the spring, on the morning of April 20th, in the way you think about things you will never be able to say to the person they concern. Through all of this, Tikas held the colony together. He mediated disputes between families. He organized the distribution of relief funds. He communicated with the Union's national leadership. He maintained the school and the medical tent and the committee that managed the camp's food stores. He organized the baseball diamond in November, not because November was a baseball month, but because a baseball diamond was a statement. Not to the guard on the ridge, but to the people in the tents, who needed to see the space being claimed, the ordinary pleasure being insisted upon, the summer game being prepared for in the winter cold, as an act of faith that summer would arrive, and they would still be there when it did. Through all of this, the Guard maintained its presence on the ridge. Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt commanded the Ludlow detachment. There is a specific type of man that military organizations produce and then misuse. The man who has internalized authority as an end rather than a means, who understands power as permission to apply force rather than the responsibility to withhold it. Linderfelt was this type. His service in the Philippines and Cuba had returned him convinced that certain categories of people were problems to be managed rather than persons to be treated with. The striking miners fell, in his taxonomy, firmly into the problem category. He conducted operations with what he considered efficiency and what the miners considered harassment. His men swept the camp with searchlights at night, arrested Union leaders on charges routinely dismissed, but that served their purpose regardless, removing organized men from camp for a few days, disrupting the administrative continuity that Ticas worked to maintain. Governor Elias Ammons had called in the National Guard in October, ostensibly to keep the peace. The practical effect was placing armed men between the strikers and the strike-breaking. The Guard was funded in part by the coal operators. CF&I's money moved through channels into the Guard's operational budget, meaning the men charged with keeping peace between miners and company were being paid by the company. A conflict of interest apparently invisible to every official in Denver who looked at it, or perhaps not invisible but acceptable, which in some ways is worse. Ticas went to Linderfelt twice in October and once in November to request a reduction in these provocations. The meetings were formally civil, in the manner of two men who dislike each other conducting business with witnesses. Linderfelt heard him out, said he understood the concerns, and continued operations as before. Ticas filed complaints with the governor's office. The complaints received acknowledgement letters. The operations continued. In the third week of March, Trinidad took Milo aside and said, without preamble, "I think they're going to try something before the summer. Not a fight. A conclusion." He had seen this before. The way pressure builds for months without release. The way a company's patience for a strike has limits. The way the men on the ridge had been replaced by those less interested in keeping peace and more interested in ending trouble. "Be ready," he said. "That means knowing where your family is, knowing where the exit is. The pit." Milo went home and told Parthena. She listened with her hands still and her eyes on him. When he finished, she said, "I'll practice with the children tomorrow. We'll make it a game." She practiced. She made it a game. Stavrok thought it excellent preparation for what he still called a fort. Katina was uncertain, not of the pit, but of the sound of something large above them, the board sliding over, the dark arriving all at once. Parthena held her hand and told her that dark was safe, that dark was the thing that hid you from danger, that dark was where you waited until the danger passed, and then you came back up into the light, which was still there, which was always still there. The April air smelled of sage and the dry sweetness of Colorado in early spring. The baseball diamond was dry. The children played in it after school, and the adults watched from outside their tents, and the guard watched from the ridge, and the spring came on, regardless. April 20th was Easter Monday. For the Greek families, it was the day after the Orthodox Easter celebration that had run through the previous night, the midnight mass in the open air, candles held in the dark, the chanting that moved through the cold air and rose above everything into the stars. Christos Anesti, Alethos Anesti, call and response across the assembled people who were Greek and who were not Greek, but who stood with the Greeks in that moment, because the moment was real, and being in it was worth more than the distance of custom. Milo had stood in that circle with Stavros's hand in his left and Parthena's in his right, and Katina asleep against Parthena's shoulder. The candle in front of him was small and unsteady in the April wind. He held it with the extra care you give things that are fragile and necessary. In the morning of April 20th, he woke early and lay listening to the colony come awake. The sounds were familiar: stoves catching, children's voices, the creak of canvas in morning wind. He got up, dressed, went outside for water, and stood in the April morning and looked north at the ridge. The guard was on the ridge in force, more than usual. He registered this: the number of men, the position of the machine gun, the purposeful movement along the ridge line, and went back into the tent. He told Parthena what he had seen. She nodded once, finished the coffee, and said, "If anything happens," he said. "The pit." She said, "Yes, and I'll bring other children." He looked at her in the morning light of the tent, the filtered gray-gold light through canvas that made her face look like a photograph of itself, softened and complete. Then he went to find Trinidad. At approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, the machine gun on Water Tank Hill opened fire. The sound was not what Milo had expected, even though Trinidad had warned him. A machine gun is a ripping sound, a mechanical tearing, like canvas being torn at speed by something that has no reason to stop. This was accurate. What words couldn't convey was the quality of the silence in the half-second before the sound reached full comprehension, the moment where skin and ears and some ancient layer beneath thought understand what is happening before the rational mind completes the sentence. Then the rational mind completed the sentence, and Milo ran. He was in the colony's northern section, talking to a miner named Alexios, when the machine gun fired. Alexios was immediately on the ground and crawling, and Milo was already in motion, running south toward Parthena and the children and the pit, and around him the colony was erupting in a controlled panic that was also, in its controlled aspect, extraordinary. People moving with purpose, not randomly, because many of them had prepared for this, because 6 months of preparation meant that when the moment arrived, a community could do the thing. The machine gun fired in bursts, long ripping bursts, then 2 or 3 seconds of silence, then another burst. The bullets went through canvas without ceremony and found whatever they found on the other side. From the south, miners with rifles were moving to drainage ditches and behind concrete foundations, returning fire. Milo ran to the school tent. Parthena was already on one knee counting children, her hand touching each head, and she looked up at him with an expression that was entirely without panic. This was one of the things he loved about her. She said, "Go get your rifle. I have this." He went. Parthena had 14 children in the school tent when the firing started. She counted heads and moved. The school tent had no pit directly beneath it. The ground had been frozen when they arrived, and nobody got around to digging beneath it. And now, this was the situation. The closest pit was the one beneath the Petrucci tent, 20 yards to the west. She made a decision in the time it took to stand. She would take the children to the Petrucci pit and the Anastos pit in 2 groups. She took the 7 youngest first. She ran them across 20 yards of open camp, a crossing that took 12 seconds and that the machine gun ignored, and arrived to find Celia Petrucci already taking her own children down, with Francesco helping, getting Lucy down, and Giuseppe down, and the baby Frank, 4 months old, wrapped in a blanket, making no sound. Parthena said, "My children too. There are 7 of them." Celia Petrucci, who had the Calabrian woman's attitude toward catastrophe, address it practically and grieve later, said, Yes, in, quickly. They put 14 children into the pit. The pit was deep, and the children fit by standing close together, the smallest on the laps of the largest, with the specific cooperation of children who understand they are in danger and look to adults for the signal that tells them what to do. Celia Petrucci went in. Parthena went back for the second group. She ran back to the school tent. The second group was there. 7 children, including 3 she didn't recognize, who had followed from another direction, and who were now her responsibility, without her choosing it, and without any possibility of choosing otherwise. Her own children, Stavros and Katina. Stavros had Katina's hand, and was watching the tent door for his mother with everything he had. Every atom of patience and control a 6-year-old can assemble. She took them both into her arms for 1 second, and then moved. She ran back across the camp with 7 children. The machine gun had changed aim, tracking the ditch where miners were firing from, and rounds were coming close to the western edge of the camp, close enough to hear in dry ground and canvas that small, precise sound. Multiple. She got the 7 children into the Anastos pit, her pit, the one she had practiced with, where she had made the entering of the dark into a game. She looked at Stavros. She said, "You stay here. You are in charge. Everyone stays until I come back." Stavros said, "Yes, Mama." She put the board over the pit and went back to the Petrucci tent. She spent the morning moving between the 2 pits, checking boards, bringing water when she could get to the barrel, moving through the firing in the spaces between bursts, learning the rhythm of it the way you learn the rhythm of dangerous weather. Demetria and Spiro Kalentos found her, and she directed them to the Anastos pit. An Italian woman came to her with 3 children, and she took them to a 3rd pit. She moved through the burning day, doing what she had told Milo she would do. She took care of children. Around her and above her, the battle continued. Milo held the left flank of the eastern ditch with Trinidad organizing beside him. The miners held through the morning. The guard was positioned above and well armed, but the drainage ditches and the railroad embankment gave the miners cover, and Trinidad managed the defense with the patient geometry of a man running a calculation under fire, moving men between positions, calling adjustments in the Spanish and English that carried across the colony in short bursts between the guns. He did not hate the soldiers implementing the policy. He had learned this about himself in the Mexican Revolution. He understood the mechanism that produced them, the institutional authority that teaches a man to stop asking whether the thing he is doing is right, and start asking only whether he is doing it correctly. He had been that man once, briefly, before the revolution made a different kind of man available to him. He did not hate Corporal Lyle Dimmick, whoever Lyle Dimmick was. He aimed at him anyway. Corporal Lyle Dimmick was 22 years old, on April 20th, 1914. He was from Pueblo, a railroader's family, his father on the Colorado and Southern for 21 years. He had joined the Guard in 1912 because it paid $3 a week for weekend drills, and his father suggested it. Then the strike happened, and weekend drills became something else. He had been at Ludlow since November. He had walked the perimeter, run the searchlight, participated in 3 arrests of colony men who were then released. He had looked down into the camp from the ridge many times and observed the women washing clothes in the creek, the children on the baseball diamond, the school tent from which the sound of singing came on clear mornings. He had constructed the story told to him: dangerous agitators, armed foreigners, threats to Colorado's economic order. Over the top of what he observed, the way you construct a story over inconvenient evidence when the story is what you need to believe to be where you are. On April 20th, he was at the Gatling gun position on Water Tank Hill when the order came. He executed the order. He operated the mechanism. The specific sensation was different from what he'd expected. More mechanical, less responsive, the feeling of operating a device rather than wielding a weapon, the feeling of being a component in a system rather than an agent with a will. This distinction mattered to him later. It had the specific attraction of partial truth. He was following orders. He was part of the mechanism. The mechanism was decided by people above him. This was the story. Not quite a lie. The kind of partial truth a person builds a life on when the full truth is unlivable. In the afternoon, the order came to advance into the colony. The guard moved from the ridge and entered the camp from the north. The miners fell back south, toward the arroyo and the railroad tracks, still firing, still organized. The retreat conducted with the military discipline Trinidad had imposed on it. A retreat that goes to pieces is a massacre. This retreat held. The guard was in the camp. Lieutenant Linderfelt walked through it. Here is what is known about Linderfelt in the hours between the guard's entry and the lighting of the tents. He found Louis Ticas in the camp. Ticas had stayed. Ticas had been attempting to negotiate a ceasefire for hours, moving between the colony and the guard positions with a white flag, and the conviction that the thing being done to the people in the tents could be stopped if the right argument reached the right door. The right door had not opened. Ticas was standing in the central row when the guard entered, and he did not run. The accounts of what followed differ, as accounts of this kind always differ, fragmented by the interests of the recorders. But they converge on this. Linderfelt had a rifle with a wooden stock, and at some point he raised it and brought the stock down on Ticas's head with force sufficient to break the stock. Ticas went down. He was taken prisoner. He was in guard custody. A short time later, the exact time disputed, witnesses placing it between 30 minutes and 2 hours after capture, Ticas was shot in the back, 3 bullets, from behind, while a prisoner. The accounts attribute this to one of 3 possible sets of hands, all connected to Linderfelt's command. For moral purposes, the specific hand is immaterial. Ticas was in guard custody. The guard was Linderfelt's. Linderfelt was present. The bullet entered from behind. Louis Ticas was 30 years old. He had held 1,200 people together with the force of his character and the discipline of his care. He had sat on Milo's wooden crate and eaten Parthena's food, and told Stavros about horses. He had looked at things further away than you could see. He was gone. The tents were lit in the late afternoon. The guard moved through the colony, setting fire to the canvas. Accounts from guard members given later characterized this as necessary. The tents contained weapons, materials posing a danger. Military necessity required it. None of the men who testified to this necessity were ever asked by any court why military necessity required lighting tents rather than removing people from them, or whether any effort was made before igniting canvas to determine whether human beings were beneath it. The fires spread with the speed that dry cotton in dry air accelerates to. The camp had burned brightly in October and been replaced. It burned finally in April and was not replaced. Dimmock stood and watched the tents burn. From the southern position, Milo saw the fire rising. He saw it the way you see a thing you have been building for 6 months. The specific way fire destroys what it destroys when you know what you built and how you built it. He saw the school tent go. He saw the center row go. He saw fire reach the area where the Anastos tent and the Petrucci tent stood, and he stood to run, and Trinidad pulled him back and said, "Wait. The board will hold. Wait. The board is thick, and it is heavy, and it will hold." He said it 7 times in the next hour. Milo counted. Then it was dark, and the colony was ash and burning poles and smoke, and the guard had pulled back to the ridge, and the miners were in the arroyo, and the night was there. Milo lay in the dirt and looked at the stars. He thought about what Parthena had said about the dark, that dark was safe, that dark was where you waited until the danger passed. He waited. Around midnight, a miner came from the direction of the arroyo and said there were people getting out from the south edge. 2 women, a man, sheltering under a concrete foundation. He had seen no one come from under the tents in the burned section. Milo was on his feet before the sentence finished. Trinidad was beside him. They could not go to the main section until close to dawn. The guard had pickets on the ridge, and the exposed ground in the moonlight was the wrong bet. They waited and did the arithmetic that men in terrible situations do. The pits were deep. The boards were heavy. There was air exchange beneath a board in a way there wasn't in a sealed space. They said these things and believed them mostly, and waited for the light. The rest has already been told. The light came. They went. Parthena came up first, then Katina, then Stavros. 6 children out of the Anastos pit, all living, and then the other pit, and Trinidad going to find something to cover them, and the priest coming from Trinidad on a wagon before anyone had called him, because the news was already traveling. The names of those who died in the pit beneath the Petrucci tent are recorded in the coroner's report, in the congressional testimony, in the archives of the United Mine Workers of America, in the records of every investigation conducted into what happened at Ludlow on April 20th, 1914. They are set down here without commentary. Frank Petrucci, 4 months old. Lucy Petrucci, 2 years old. Joe Petrucci, 4 years old. Elvira Valdez, 3 months old. Eulala Valdez, 8 years old. Mary Valdez, 7 years old. Rogerlo Pedregon, 6 years old. Cloriva Pedregon, 4 years old. And others. The records give the names of 11 children and 2 women, Celia Petrucci among the women. The full list varying slightly between sources compiled from incomplete information in the days after the fire. 11 children, 2 women, 13 people who had placed themselves below the level of the bullets to wait for the danger to pass. Cardor, here is the math that no one with power wanted to do in 1913. The UMWA's demands, if met in full, would have cost CF&I approximately 40 cents per ton of coal, above what they were currently paying. CF&I mined approximately 6 million tons of coal per year in southern Colorado. Meeting the miners' demands, the wage increase, the 8-hour day, the right to a check weighman, the enforcement of laws already on the books, would have run roughly $2.5 million annually. CF&I's net income in 1913 was approximately $6 million. The strike cost them more than the demands would have. The 14 months of the strike, combined with operational disruption, the cost of mine guards, the cost of supporting the National Guard, the cost of the legal proceedings that followed, ran to an estimated $4 million. The children in the pit died over a cost that, had it been accepted, would have been smaller than the cost of refusing it. They died over 40 cents per ton. They died over a calculation that did not include them in the values being calculated, because the people doing the calculating did not regard them as values. In the days after April 20th, the news went out across Colorado. It traveled by telegraph and newspaper, and word of mouth along the routes between the coal camps, and the form it took as it traveled was not the abstract form of a labor dispute, but the specific, particular human form of children's names. 11 children, 4 months, 2 years, 4 years, 8 years. The ages went out along the telegraph lines and into every coal camp in southern Colorado, and the men in those camps did the arithmetic that men with children do when they hear those ages. The 10 Days' War began on April 22nd. It was not a war in the formal sense. It was an organized, sustained series of attacks on mine properties across the southern Colorado coal fields, a response to Ludlow, by men who had heard what happened and who decided that the language of negotiation and petition and congressional testimony was not producing results adequate to the situation. Trinidad Espinoza led a group of 18 men from the arroyo at Ludlow on the night of April 22nd. He had spent the previous day in the position that was now familiar, the man who understood what needed to be done and did not want to do it. The man who could see the logic of violence without wanting it to be his logic. The man who had come north from Mexico partly to leave that logic behind. He sat with it for a day, and then he stood up and went to the men already preparing and said, "I'll lead." Quietly, without drama. Understood immediately, because Trinidad's decisions had that quality. Settled somewhere private, and then announced when complete, the settled quality communicating itself. They burned the Hastings mine tipple on the night of April 22nd. They cut the railroad line east of Aguilar on April 23rd. They attacked the Forbes mine on April 24th, burning company property while avoiding residential buildings. A targeting discipline Trinidad enforced rigidly, not from illusions about property rights, but because he had no interest in doing to anyone what had been done at Ludlow, and maintaining that distinction required will even in anger, especially in anger. Blair Mountain, 1921, 7 years later and several states east, would follow the same pattern. Company towns, evicted workers, armed miners, government intervention, no convictions, incremental reform. The industry produced these events with the regularity of an uncorrected mechanism. This is not a comfortable observation. It is an accurate one. Agnes Volk heard about the 10 Days' War from the Trinidad newspaper and sat in her kitchen with coffee going cold and thought about the mechanism that produced men who didn't want to be in a war and then went to one anyway. She knew what that mechanism was called. The name wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the 7 months she had spent driving to the colony and back. All the bread and wool blankets and hard candy. And the simple failure of those things to stop what happened. The way generosity at the personal level is insufficient against violence at the structural level. The way individual kindness cannot substitute for systemic change that would have made the kindness unnecessary. She wrote in her journal on April 25th, "I have been putting bandages on something that needed surgery. Approximately 200 people died in the 10 days following the Ludlow Massacre. President Woodrow Wilson sent federal troops on April 29th. They arrived, and the miners stood down before federal authority, not because they had been defeated, but because the federal government was not, at this moment, the same instrument as the state government, and the miners were making distinctions." The congressional investigation convened in June 1914. Among the witnesses was a woman named Maria Petrucci, no relation to Francesco and Celia, who had sheltered in a drainage ditch through April 20th and testified to the Commission on Industrial Relations about the morning of April 21st. Her testimony, given in a voice that Commission member Florence Harriman later described as the quietest voice she had ever heard say the loudest things, included this. She said she came back in the morning when the fires were out. She walked through the camp and came to the place where the Petrucci tent had been, and she saw the board on the ground, and she knew what was under it. She stood there for a long time before she could move the board. When she moved it, she said, she saw children. She saw children the way you find them, sleeping, close together, the way they get when they're cold. They looked like they were sleeping. And she covered them back up and went to find the priest. The Commission heard her testimony. The Commission issued its final report in 1916. It concluded that conditions in the Colorado coal mines justified the strike, that the National Guard had exceeded its authority at Ludlow, and that CF&I management bore responsibility for creating the conditions that led to the massacre. It did not lead to criminal charges. It produced a report. The report went into the archive. Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt was court-martialed within the National Guard's internal justice system, not for the deaths in the pit, not for the machine gun attack on the colony, not for the execution of a prisoner attempting to negotiate a ceasefire, for the assault on Louis Ticas with the rifle stock. He was found guilty of the assault charge and punished accordingly. The punishment for ordering the burning of a tent colony full of children was a demotion, not a prison sentence, a demotion. from one rank to a slightly lower rank, in the same organization, doing the same work. This is what the institution decided was proportionate. This is the weight it assigned to what happened in the pit: a rank, a title, a step on a ladder from which Linderfelt was moved, not removed. He retained his freedom and his pension and his lifetime. No National Guard officer was convicted of a crime in connection with the deaths at Ludlow. No Guard soldier served a day in prison for what happened in the pit. John D. Rockefeller, Jr. testified before the Commission on Industrial Relations in January 1915. He testified for 3 days with the specific precision of a man prepared by lawyers. He expressed sympathy for the families of those who died. He accepted no personal responsibility. He explained his management philosophy and his belief in the rights of the individual workman. He said he had not been informed of specific conditions at Ludlow before the attack. He said these things in a tone so calm and reasonable that the contrast between the tone and its subject, 11 children in a pit, the bodies of women, the burned shell of a community, was itself a statement, though not the one he was intending. Sympathy. He expressed sympathy. The strike continued through the summer and fall of 1914, increasingly exhausted, increasingly underfunded as the UMWA's treasury was strained by 14 months of relief payments. In December 1914, the Union accepted a settlement that included none of the original demands: no union recognition, no binding agreement on wages or hours. A company-sponsored representation plan that CF&I management controlled, the kind of offer you can only make if you have not listened to a single word the other people were saying. The men went back to work, back to company housing in company towns where the company could evict again at will, and everybody knew it. Milo and Parthena returned to the house near the Ludlow mine and went back because there was nowhere else to go. He went back to the number 4 seam on the 1st of January, 1915. He came home with coal dust in his hands and his lungs and the lines of his face, and Parthena met him at the door with the blue enamel pot on the stove and the icon on the wall, and the children sleeping, and the drawing of the horse still in the wooden crate. He sat at the table. He was very tired. She said, "Stavros asked about Giuseppe." He said, "I told him Giuseppe had to go somewhere else." She said, "I'll talk to him." He said, "I don't know how to carry this." She said, "The same way you carry everything. One step and the next one. And with the people around you. You carry it with the people around you, or you don't carry it at all." He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. Outside the company house, the Colorado night came in from the mountains the way it always came, cold and enormous, and without particular interest in what the people in the small warm rooms below it were managing or failing to manage. The mine was dark on the hill above them. Tomorrow it would be lit again, and the work would begin. He still checked the scales. Every day. He noted the numbers and kept a record. This was not the Union, not yet. But it was the thing before the Union, the thing that made the Union possible, the individual human decision to witness accurately, to count what is actually there, to refuse the convenience of looking away. The legislative response to Ludlow was slow and imperfect and insufficient, as legislative responses to human catastrophe tend to be. But it was real. The labor reforms of the following decade, the strengthening of federal oversight, the movement toward the protections that would eventually become the National Labor Relations Act, the establishing of the Department of Labor, drew energy from the public record of what had happened at Ludlow. The children in the pit did not die for nothing. They died for very little, which is a different and more terrible thing. The Ludlow Tent Colony site was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2009. The United Mine Workers of America maintains a monument at the site, installed in 1918, 4 years after the massacre. A coal miner, a woman, and a child, figures rendered in stone at larger-than-life scale, standing together at the entrance to the site, facing the road, facing the approaching visitor. They have the quality of people still waiting. They have been waiting since 1918. They are patient. Every June, a ceremony is held at the Ludlow Monument. People come from across Colorado and further, miners and descendants of miners, labor organizers and historians and students, people with a connection to the place, and people with no connection except that they heard the story and came. They gather in June because June is when the Colorado weather is reliable enough to assemble outdoors, and because gathering outdoors at this particular place is the appropriate form, the form that fits the thing being commemorated, which happened outdoors, in tents, in the open air of the Arkansas Valley. The ceremony includes music and speeches and the reading of names. The names are read aloud. They are read by a person who stands at the monument and reads each name clearly, with a pause between each name, so that the name has space to be a name, and not a list, so that each name is received individually by the people standing in the Colorado summer, and by whatever else is present at a place where people died for something they believed in. These children trusted the adults who put them underground. The adults told them they would be safe. They were not safe. The adults who dug the pit were trying to protect them. The adults on the ridge were trying to kill them. Both groups of adults were in the same country, under the same flag. The flag was flying over the National Guard's position on Watertank Hill on the morning of April 20th, 1914. The same flag flies over the monument at Ludlow today. These two facts are true simultaneously, and the tension between them does not resolve. It is meant to be carried. Tavros Anastos grew up. He became a miner for 3 years, and then a school teacher for 26 in Pueblo. He taught his students the history of Ludlow every year, from primary sources, congressional testimony, coroner's reports, UMWA archives, the words of the people who were there. He taught it the way his mother had taught him, carefully, as if the facts themselves were the argument, as if the right arrangement of true things was sufficient, as if you did not need to embellish or perform, because what the record contained was already, by itself, more than enough. He stood at the monument at Ludlow every June until he was 70 years old. He stood and listened to the names. The names were names of children he had played with, who had sat beside him in his mother's school tent learning songs in 3 languages, who had been younger than him in 1914, and who were therefore younger than him still, who would always be younger than him, who had stayed in 1914 while he went forward, who had made, in their way, in the way only the dead make things, the argument that he stood here to carry. The monument is maintained by the United Mine Workers. There is a ceremony every June. The names are read aloud. This is one of those readings. Frank Petrucci, 4 months old. Lucy Petrucci, 2 years old. Joe Petrucci, 4 years old. Elvira Valdez, 3 months old. Eulala Valdez, 8 years old. Mary Valdez, 7 years old. Rogerlo Pedregon, 6 years old. Cloriva Pedregon, 4 years old. The others, whose names the incomplete records hold imperfectly, but hold. The 2 women. Louis Ticas, 30 years old, shot in the back while a prisoner. The 25 dead at Ludlow in total. The school tent, the baseball diamond, the songs in 3 languages, the drawing of the horse, the board over the pit, the dark, the light when it came back. Their names are known. Say them.